So, with the release of X-Men 97, I decided to go back and rewatch a bunch of the old Fox X-Men movies from their X-Men universe that started in the early 2000s and stretched all the way to about 2018, 2019, and now has ended because the MCU, aka Disney, has bought the X-Men and they'll be doing their own thing with it. So in this video, I just want to rank out all 13 movies that Fox ended up producing in this X-Men universe, go through the best, the worst, the stinky, the smelly, the bad, the amazing, the masterpieces, and the shit pieces. We're gonna go through every single one of them. I'm gonna let you know what I thought. Now, this is a superhero franchise in a universe that I grew up with, and I absolutely adore it. I honestly think outside of the MCU, it's probably the second best sort of live-action superhero world we've ever gotten as like a franchise. So I'm very, very excited to talk about these movies, and I'm just gonna jump right into it. You know how these videos work. Let me know down below what I fucked up. You know, let me know what you disagree with, and give me your rankings. And here we go. Dark Phoenix is a weird movie. It's a very, very strange movie. To me, it's easily the worst in this franchise for a couple reasons. A, because it's just not a very good movie. The movie was clearly absolutely demolished in the edit room for whatever reason. This movie definitely had multiple cuts. It definitely had a Snyder Cut situation where somewhere in some studio vault there lies a pretty decent cut of this movie. But the cut that we got ended up being really, really bad. It's very slow. It has a boring villain played by Jessica Chastain, who's just kind of a nothing burger. She was supposed to be a Skrull, but because Disney was doing Skrulls in the Marvels, they kind of had to change it last minute. The movie stopped sort of being a prequel to the original X-Men movies and just sort of branched off into its own universe, so it stopped caring about continuity and kind of keeping things in check and just told a very weird sort of ending story for the X-Men universe, which I get was the point. It's the last movie they knew they were going to make, so they wanted to end it for these characters, but at the same time, we're following James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender's X-Men characters, the younger versions of the original Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen characters, and it's just kind of weird that they're sort of not getting older, even though we've been watching them for 40 years in World Timeline, and we're ignoring the original stuff. Just a weird choice. Also, you know, it was the Dark Phoenix that they fucked up yet again. Obviously, the Dark Phoenix, for some reason, they cannot get this story right, and we'll be talking about another Dark Phoenix movie in a second. But obviously, it is a big, epic story. They just keep messing it up, and this movie just was another example of how they did not know how to adapt the story. Now, why was this movie actually terrible? How did it end up being terrible? Well, because this movie was being made at a weird time when Fox was selling to Disney the rights of Fox Studios and the X-Men characters, meaning this movie came out when Disney had already owned the rights to these characters, meaning it got no marketing, it got no fair treatment, and it was a movie that was essentially just sort of thrown out there. There's another movie like it that is also on this list that I'll be talking about soon, but this movie just kind of got the bad end of the stick, and because of that, it got no attention in the edit room. It definitely didn't get any reshoots. They probably could have fixed some stuff, and it just ended up being the most forgettable and worst movie in the franchise, which is such a shame that it's the last one. It could have went out with a bang. Next up is X-Men Origins Wolverine, and everybody that's seen this movie knows, they know why this movie's near last. This movie came out kind of like at the height of the X-Men franchise. It was doing really, really well at the box office, and the studio thought, hey, here's a great idea, let's start making origin movies for all of these characters, which on paper is a brilliant idea. An X-Men origin movie is a great idea. The execution of this film, not good. Not good at all. And why is it? It's kind of hard to describe because on paper this actually sounds kind of okay. We see Wolverine's journey as from a child growing up, learning to deal with his mutant powers, his brother and Sabretooth, who I think is actually a really decent character in this movie, how he ends up getting recruited by Stryker and dealing with the team. You get Deadpool. There's a problem. Deadpool's in this movie with Ryan Reynolds, and it's Ryan Reynolds' first appearance as the character. It's bad. It's atrocious. Everybody knows it. Everybody makes jokes about it. We don't have to talk anymore. The movie just ends up being really forgettable. It's really slow and kind of drawn out, and the movie lacks a lot of the original kind of epicness that the original X-Men movies had. It lacks the tone, the vibe, and I feel like taking Wolverine's character away from the other X-Men characters is something that obviously could work, and it does work because we've seen it done later on, but they didn't really know how to do it yet in this movie, so it just sort of felt empty and messy, and it felt like an early 2000s bad comic book film, and it's one that I never rewatch. This is a movie that's like universally hated by everybody. I don't think it's that terrible. It's definitely better than Dark Phoenix, but it's not a great movie. This was the third X-Men movie in the original trilogy, which is an awesome trilogy. It's the final movie that we got really starring this main cast of X-Men with Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen. It's the last one that followed the entire older X-Men cast. Obviously, Hugh Jackman's back, and it tells the story of the Dark Phoenix, essentially. This is a movie that, yes, it's better than Dark Phoenix for a multitude of reasons. A, because it is a complete movie that had a proper final cut. It's not a movie that was kind of destroyed by studio meddling or studios being sold to each other. It is the intended movie, therefore it's a movie that looks like it had more heart and more soul in it. It wasn't just released to make a quick buck and ripped apart in the edit room. Second off, the cast here, I think, is just so iconic and so amazing to watch that it adds so much to the movie. Obviously, Patrick Stewart being back, Ian McKellen being back, Hugh Jackman in the movie. Those guys just being in the movie add a lot of value to it. But, yet again, it's not a great movie. The film does have an interesting third act, I won't lie. Its final moments don't, they work for me, if I'm gonna be honest. The whole idea of this mutant cure, although, you know, kind of the expected direction for this franchise to go in, I don't know. I didn't exactly love it. And then what happens after this movie, they kind of just throw it away, and it ended up not mattering. Like, literally all of it. Like, Xavier fucking dies, and then he's just back in the next movie, right? I remember they gave, like, some bullshit explanation that, oh, it's his twin brother who's been in a coma since he was a baby. They just wanted to forget this movie. Let's just be honest here. I just don't love this movie. I don't see a lot of people going and praising Last Stand and getting mad at people for shitting on it. It's just not a great movie. This is another movie that kind of got killed by the Disney merger. Of course, The New Mutants is a movie that for years felt like it was never going to come out. I remember we got a trailer for this thing, a trailer that actually looked kind of cool, and then it was like 3.5 years before it finally came out. Disney kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and then they just kind of quietly released it, and were like, just get out there. But The New Mutants is a very weird movie, but one that I don't entirely hate. I actually think it's a standard kind of generic Stranger Things type ripoff. A movie that wanted to tell a kind of darker, edgier story about these teens who have superpowers, and there's kind of like a creepy vibe to it. Now, on paper, The New Mutants, when it was first announced, it was at a time where Fox was actually trying to extend the X-Men universe into an MCU type thing. They had a bunch of movies planned that ended up not happening. This was one of them that ended up actually happening, sort of. At first, it was being marketed as a straight-up horror movie. That first trailer was being marketed as a horror movie. I thought this was a unique direction to take a superhero film in a time where superhero films were becoming very generic and very boring, and they still are today. And overall, although the movie does end up being a lot more generic than those trailers and the marketing ended up kind of conveying, it is a okay movie. It's better than the movies I listed before it. It's watchable, it's short, it's fun. Yet again, the biggest problem with this movie is just the fact that it felt like it was probably ripped apart in the edit room, that it was probably a riskier movie that took bigger swings and did things that are kind of bending the genre. But when Disney kind of took control, they probably went into the cutting room and cut together a version of this movie that was much more generic and much more standardized to just try to make their money back and be more presentable to general audiences. But it's not the worst thing, it's just forgettable. Whoa, first hot take, right? X1, X-Men, the original film, the one that started it all. The original 2000 X-Men movie. It was one of the biggest swings in Hollywood history. Obviously, the superhero genre was not what it was today, and they decided to take a big swing based off the animated show and do a gigantic X-Men team-up film. It's one of the first, if not the first ever, team-up superhero movie. And yeah, this film is an iconic classic. It has set standards and sort of stereotypes for comic book movies that are still found today. It introduced tons of iconic characters who are still showing up in movies today, which is crazy. But there's problems with the movie. It's just the fact that the movie just doesn't age well. This movie ends up being very, very safe. If you watch it, you know what I mean. This is a very, very safe movie, which is not really a complaint because I understand why this movie was as safe as it could possibly be, why it did not take any big swings or big punches, and why it just was a very basic story with basic visuals and basic plot lines. Why, you ask? Why was it that way? Well, because Hollywood had never taken a swing like this in a movie like this. It had never really taken a big risk on a project like X-Men. But the risk did end up paying off, which is why we got much more riskier movies later on. But this is still a movie that is fun to watch. On a rewatch, I enjoyed it. Yet again, it doesn't age particularly well, but it is still a short, fun, fast-paced ride. Great characters. I mean, Patrick Stewart, this is probably my favorite performance of him as Professor X. He's just kind of a badass. Same with Ian McKellen. Just after, I can't believe this came out around the same time as The Lord of the Rings, so you're watching him play this warm and loving Gandalf, you know, this kind man, and then he's fucking Magneto, and he looks like he could rip your face off. Like, he's just awesome. Such a great actor in this role. This is also probably like the birthplace of Kevin Feige. Obviously, he did some work on this film, and without this film, probably would have never gotten in the MCU. Bryan Singer also directed. He's a shitty human being, but he directed a lot of these movies, so get ready to hear his name a little bit. Another movie Bryan Singer directed, and this one is also really hated on. I don't hate X-Men Apocalypse. I think this movie's okay. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. This was the follow-up to 2014's X-Men Days of Futures Past, a movie I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. A movie that I love. Obviously, I haven't talked about it yet, so that means I like it more than this. X-Men Apocalypse had a lot going for it. Obviously, Apocalypse is one of, if not the biggest X-Men villain. He is this big Thanos-like entity, the most powerful mutant ever. This dude who's just a walking, talking, killing machine. And he's going to be facing off with the Young X-Men team from the previous two movies. This was essentially going to be the trilogy ender of the Young X-Men movies. Besides, they might have made a fourth movie, but let's forget about that. We've already talked about it. The whole cast is coming back. You also introduce Oscar Isaac as Apocalypse, and then you bring in a whole bunch of new X-Men like Jean, like Cyclops, all these people that had not appeared yet who are all great. This movie does have its problems. First off, Apocalypse looks ridiculous. Just the design of the character was really dumb. But Oscar Isaac does his best. I kind of enjoy his performance here. The movie's plot, a little nonsensical. Another problem with this movie, every X-Men movie to this point kind of operated on a smaller scale. We were dealing with sort of stories about humans versus the mutants, different aspects of society versus the mutants, right? We hadn't really gotten the mutants fighting a super god Thanos-level threat. So I'm not sure the people involved in this movie exactly knew how to translate these characters to like a big Avengers type story like that. And it shows, because Apocalypse, although he is a threat, never feels as big as some of the biggest MCU threats that we've gotten. He never feels like a Thanos level villain. Stakes never feel truly that high. The third act never feels as epic as it needs to be. But there are a lot of good stuff in this movie. I think a lot of the stuff they did with Magneto and his family was done really well. I think the scene where they're playing like Beethoven and Oscar Isaac is just screaming and they shoot nukes and like, that's awesome. That scene was cool. You can't deny it. I like this movie a lot. I don't understand why people hate it as much as they do. It's fine. Here's another movie that people hate for some reason. The Wolverine is a great movie. It's just really, really good. It has a very bad third act. That's pretty much the only problem here. The first couple acts of this movie are nearly perfect. They're everything you would want from a Wolverine movie. And if you really think about it, this is the only, like, real comic book Wolverine movie we've ever gotten. Because X-Men Origins was terrible. Logan is a very different style of movie. This is just a straight-up action, adventure Wolverine film. He's in Japan. He's fighting samurais. He's going through a bunch of crazy shit. You get a great opening of the movie. You get a pretty decent story here with a lot of foreshadowing the future events. This is a movie that I just think is good. It's really good, actually. I just think the third act kind of becomes a CGI fest. It becomes nonsense. It becomes kind of just over the top to a point that I just could not get into it. But The Wolverine is a movie that I go back and rewatch all the time. I think it's a lot of fun. It's not James Mangold's best work. His best work might be appearing later on this list, but it's definitely a solid movie. It's also not James Mangold's worst work, because we have Indiana Jones to look at, right? Let's thank Disney for that one. Great job, guys. But overall, Wolverine is a great movie. Now, I'll never forget when the test footage for this movie leaked, I think around 2015 or 2016, and everybody on the internet collectively said, how is this not a movie? How has this not gotten greenlit? And then it got greenlit! And then we had a Deadpool movie. Now, why am I ranking Deadpool 1 over Deadpool 2? And I'll talk about Deadpool 2 more in a few minutes, but the one thing I'll say about Deadpool 1, it is an amazing movie, but it also, similar to the original X-Men, played it a little bit safer than I think Deadpool 2 did, and then I definitely think Deadpool 3 is going to do. The movie definitely felt like, we're not going to give it all. We're going to pull some punches back, and we're going to make this movie as presentable as we can without completely alienating some audience members that we think we might alienate. And because of that, it ranks a little bit below it. This is still a great movie that introduces us to one of the wildest, craziest, and funniest characters that the X-Men universe, or really the Marvel universe, has to offer. It's such a different comic book film than anything we've gotten over the last decade, with the fourth wall breaking, with the ridiculousness of it all, with the self-awareness, with the references. Ryan Reynolds gives probably his most iconic character and his most iconic performance of his entire career. The action here is actually a lot of fun. The sound and music supervision is really great. I think the villains were kind of interesting and had a personal connection to Deadpool himself. The emotional sort of love story and finding yourself story here actually, like, works thematically. And of course, the movie's hilarious. That's, like, the main thing you're coming here for a funny movie. You want to laugh, and it is a hilarious movie. This movie holds up today. It's a great comic book movie, and it launched what is now one of the biggest X-Men franchises the will ever have.
I've been shaking, I've been blending back.
And then Deadpool 2, I think, ranks slightly above Deadpool 1. Why? Because it just kind of expanded the character, and it took bigger swings, and it was crazier, it was wilder, had more references, had bigger fights, had a bigger budget. It was just a crazier version of the first movie. Obviously, we get the introduction of Cable, played by Josh Brolin, who is so good in the role, and it's so sad that I don't think he's coming back for the third movie, but he's so great here, just kind of playing this badass, quiet asshole that kind of contrasts Deadpool, who's hilarious and outrageous, right? And it's such a good pairing, and they have great chemistry together. You get Juggernaut in the film, you get a bunch of actual mutant stories talking about how mutants are being kind of discriminated against, which connects to the X-Men world. It makes so many different references and jokes to not only the larger X-Men world, but the Marvel world, the DC world, and pop culture in general. A lot of the action scenes are great. I love the stuff with the X-Force. It's hilarious. This movie's awesome, and it's not talked about enough so I think Deadpool 2 is very underrated. It's not talked about really at all. It's bizarre, actually. This is a great movie. I love Deadpool 2. After the disaster that was The Last Stand and X-Men Origins Wolverine, the X-Men universe needed a reset. So they sort of wanted to do a reboot, but they also didn't want to do a reboot. So what they did instead is they took the characters and did an origin movie for the X-Men that goes way back. Now, I actually don't know the story about this one. I wonder if, like, the original plan with X-Men Origins Wolverine, I wonder if this movie was just originally going to be called X-Men Origins X-Men. It just be like an origin story of the X-Men, and then it ended up becoming just a new trilogy when that movie sucked. But either way, Matthew Vaughn, who's a great filmmaker, comes in to direct this origin story of the X-Men, which follows a young version of the cast, starred by James McAvoy, who plays an awesome version of Professor X, and Michael Fassbender, who plays an awesome version of Magneto. You got Kevin Bacon in the movie, who's the villain. You also get Jennifer Lawrence playing Mystique, who they make one of the greatest characters in comic book history. She is just so awesome in this trilogy. This movie is incredible. It is so underrated in the grand scheme of, like, what are the best superhero movies. This is one of them. It is a great movie that had a lot riding on it, and I think it single-handedly kind of saved this franchise at this time. There are times this movie moves a little bit too slow. There's a lot of characters that are sort of forgettable that either get written off during this movie or after this movie that just kind of go nowhere, but there is a decent villain here. There's a really good third act that finds a way to weave itself with history in such an interesting way that I just absolutely found fascinating. A lot of the mutant powers in this movie are done well. The chemistry between Fassbender and James McAvoy is unbelievable, which really makes this whole trilogy of movies incredible, but really you could see it here. I love the costumes here. I love the turn in the third act with Michael Fassbender. This is just a great movie. Go back and rewatch First Class. Give it another try. I guarantee you'll love it. X2 ranked a lot lower on this list originally, but I just rewatched it, and I completely forgot how amazing this movie is. Similarly to Deadpool and Deadpool 2, I said originally the first Deadpool movie was very standard, didn't take too many risks. Second movie kind of expanded on everything, which is why it's better. This is the same situation. The original X-Men, very standard, very safe, don't want to take too many risks. This movie said, fuck those risks, we're taking all of them, we're doing all the risk, we're going to make the craziest, most expansive X-Men movie ever. We're going to take a lot of the ideas we were working on the first movie and just expand on the themes, the lore, the visuals, everything. This is a great movie. Dare I say the most underrated comic book movie of all time. So this movie is essentially about the X-Men after they battled Magneto in the previous movie, and you get this president of the United States who's been attacked by a mutant. So because of that, in response, he sent a man named Stryker off to the X-Men to investigate them, to kind of go after Charles Xavier, and obviously it's a humans versus mutants type battle. There's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of scheming involved. There's a lot of really bad people involved and good people involved. You don't know who to trust. You don't know what's going on exactly, and it's a really kind of psychological movie, but also one that at its core is still about what does it mean to be a mutant? What do these people want? They just want to sort of live, and it's got all of those thematical resonance that worked in the first movie and work in the series as a whole. This is one of my favorite Hugh Jackman performances. I think he's so good here. I think Magneto is incredible in the movie. The villain is great. I mean, Stryker's just running around this entire movie just going, fuck off! It's just an awesome movie. It's also really shot well. Like, there's a shot earlier in the movie where they're trying to drug a guy, and there's, like, under the bar, the camera's right there, and they slide the glass over, and you could see the fucking pills in the glass. It's a really good shot. I don't want to give credit to the director here, because yet again, I mentioned he's a piece of shit. It was a good shot. You also get that scene in the movie where you know, Magneto is like, ooh, too much iron in the blood, and you know what I'm talking about. That shit's crazy. It's an awesome movie. Go watch X2, give it another shot. It's honestly, it could be ranked #1 in a list like this. It's amazing.
I hurt myself today.
Logan is a movie that's very different from any other comic book movie we've ever seen. It's a movie that I compare to something like Joker or The Batman. It's not your standardized comic book action movie. It's something that can be more sort of directed towards an auteur type movie, a movie made for cinephiles, for people who love films, dare I say, Oscar baity type movies. Movies that follow a different code. I might even call this movie a real movie. Now, obviously, I'm kind of joking, but at the same time, this is not your standard Marvel MCU movie. It's very different from anything DC's putting out. It's a very serious character study about this older, griddled Wolverine and this older, griddled Professor X who are kind of going across the country on the run, being hunted, and taking care of this little girl who is X-23. In turn, it's Logan's daughter in a way. And it's a very emotional story about the final days of Wolverine and the end, pretty much the overall end of the X-Men story, which is a very tragic end if you're somebody who's watched all these movies. It's very tragic, but at the same time has a glimmer of hope at the end. A glimmer of hope we'll never see, but that's okay. We should have never gotten a follow-up to this movie. I know they were planning one. Thank God we didn't. We don't need that. But this movie is beautiful. It's beautifully shot. It's one of James Mangold's best works as a filmmaker, and he is an incredible filmmaker, except for Indiana Jones. But other than that, great filmmaker. You got a Hugh Jackman performance that probably should have been nominated for an Oscar. The movie's gritty. It's brutal. It earns that R rating. The third act is insane. Obviously, Logan, it's one of the best comic book movies ever. I absolutely adore this movie. When it first came out, I thought it was the greatest thing ever. But there's one movie above this list that I think is underrated in the grand scheme of comic book movies. It's a movie that I cannot believe is not talked about more. And it's a movie that I just rewatched and still to this day cannot believe how good it is. Days of Futures Past is an odyssey in the comic book movie genre. This is a movie that should not have worked as good as it is. First off, Days of Futures Past is one of the biggest and most complicated comic book storylines ever. It's a story that I can't even believe they attempted to adapt because it is absolutely insane. In the comics, it involves Ultron. It involves the same kind of going back in time and resetting the timeline thing. All that stuff, except this movie does it in a very different way. We don't have Ultron. We don't have the Avengers. So what do we have? Let's send Wolverine back in time to stop the Sentinels from being created. How were the Sentinels created? Well, all the way back in time, Mystique killed this dude. They ended up kidnapping her, stealing her DNA, and applying her powers to these Sentinel bots. That is a very, very, very smart plot line that takes this huge story about these Sentinels in the future who are destroying the world and shrinks it down to a very personal character story. We have to stop Mystique from becoming a murderer and killing her first person, who's played by Peter Dinklage, who's great in this movie, by the way. You take an epic story and you shrink it down the size. That's how you do these things. It's what makes these movies interesting, because they are epic stories with epic consequences, but you bring it down to a level to where us, real human beings that don't have superpowers, can understand and connect with. This is a very personal story between a lot of these characters, and obviously, the obvious part that I haven't even stated yet, it's a movie that found a way to mix both casts. We have the older cast, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, they're all here. You have Hugh Jackman in the middle of it, and then you get the younger cast, James McAvoy giving his best performance, Michael Fassbender giving his best performance. You mix all of it. It's one of the greatest crossovers ever. They found a way to do it perfectly. And like I said, this movie is a personal story about these characters and their relationships with each other, between Professor X and Magneto, and what's happened since First Class, and sort of how their personalities have connected. It's between Beast and Mystique and all of these characters, and of course, Wolverine at the center of it, who does have an emotional arc here that I do at times think kind of gets thrown to the wayside. He is the protagonist of this movie, but sometimes it really doesn't feel like it. But it all builds and builds and builds to a third act that isn't this epic clash of CGI nonsense, but more of a methodical moment between these characters that brings sort of the whole saga together in a beautiful way. This movie's incredible, and I haven't even mentioned the Quicksilver moment, which, come on, it's like the best superhero thing. It's definitely the best speedster thing we've ever gotten in movies. That scene blows me away today. I was laughing my ass off seeing it for the first time in movie theaters, and I was laughing my ass off watching it again last night. This is an incredible movie, dare I say, a masterpiece. I would make the argument, and maybe I'm reaching here, this is probably, for me, you look at the greatest superhero movies of all time. Obviously, Dark Knight, probably number one. Number two, maybe one of the Spider-Mans, maybe No Way Home, maybe Batman Begins, right? But number three or number four has to be this movie. This movie is insanely good. And if you think I'm wrong, go back and rewatch it. If this thing came out today, it would be one of the biggest fucking things ever. It's insanely good, well written, and how much it balances the amount of characters, ideas, worlds, stakes. It balances so much that the fact that this script was written as well as it was is incredibly impressive. It's why it's my #1 movie on this list. I love Days of Futures Past. So let me know, guys, what did I get wrong? What did I get right? Leave your rankings down below. Let me know what you want to see from the MCU's X-Men. I'm counting Deadpool versus Wolverine, or Deadpool and Wolverine, not as an X-Men movie, but as an MCU movie, because that's what it is. So everything going forward will be in that. This is just the Fox movies. Do you want to see a new cast, or do you want to see them bring back all the old cast again? Do you want to see Giancarlo Esposito playing Professor X? I do. Yes, please. Do that. Yes, Kevin Feige, do that. And then let's make, like, Keanu Reeves Magneto. Fuck it. Why not? Thanks for watching. Like this video and subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next one.